Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by, and welcome to the Knowledge Leadership Series webinar. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. Should you wish to ask a question during the presentation, please use the chat feature located in the lower hand of your screen. If you need to reach an operator at any time, please press *0. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded Thursday, February 18, 2016. Thank you. I will now like to turn the conference over to Ms. Robin Thompson. Please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'm Robin Thompson, and on behalf of the team at BIA, we want to welcome you to the February edition of our Knowledge Leadership Series. Before I get to my favorite part of the program, which is introducing our guest speaker, just a very quick reminder to send your questions through the chat window, and we'll answer those at the end of the program. And second, our curriculum is planned directly from your feedback. As you exit today, you'll be prompted to answer a short survey, and if you just take 5 or 6 seconds to answer that for us and help us improve, we would be so very grateful. Now, my favorite part of today's program. You know, many of us believe ourselves to be old hands in electronic discovery, even predating the 2006 eDiscovery rules. Then there's our speaker. The first memorandum to the U.S. Judicial Conference from the American Bar Association on the need to reform the judicial rules for digital evidence was co-authored by him back in 1994. Since then, Jeffrey Ritter has been a passionate advocate for helping navigate the collisions between the law and each new generation of technology, always looking forward. In fact, of his new book, Achieving Digital Trust, Peter Sand of MGM Resorts International said, "I don't know why Jeffrey came back from the future to share with us what lies ahead, but he did, and I'm grateful." And so am I. It's going to be an addition to my collection of valuable books. If you want to know more about his contributions, Google him. With that being said, BIA is so pleased Jeffrey can join us today, still here in the present, at least for a little while, helping us learn how to build a business case for information governance in your company. Welcome, Jeffrey.
Well, thank you, Robin, and thank you to BIA for inviting me to join you. This program has an outstanding reputation, and I feel a little bit humbled by the fact you reached out to have me join you. But Dr. Emmett Brown just told me that when I use the flux capacitor to come back from the future, it will only last 45 minutes. Now, your audience is a busy group of people, and their time is valuable. And, well, I have 7 more cinematic references to work into this presentation, from Star Wars and Indiana Jones and Butch Cassidy and some other surprises. So it's time for me to get started. Now, in this presentation, it was unusual because you asked people to give you questions, what they wanted it to respond to. And not only did you get a few questions, there were a lot of questions. And I think they boil down to these 2 essential issues. First, people have said, I know information governance is the right thing to do, but how do I make an effective business case? And second, what can be measured to evidence that we are governing information effectively and not just stockpiling the data into digital haystacks? Well, those are tough questions. And frankly, as a profession, as vendors, within the public sector and at the morning dining room table when we have our breakfast in the headlines, I think we're at a crossroads. Innovation is cascading down upon us, and it's challenging us from all geographic regions and technology systems. I mean, there's Hadoop and MapReduce and Google Cars and RFID wristbands on employees' wrists in the warehouse, blockchaining, application containers, microservices. Wow. But eDiscovery over the last 15 years has been exposing how poorly engineered our data was in order for it to be retrieved as evidence of the truth. And yet, despite those shortcomings, we're still seeing our requests for funding and resources be compromised, be limited, be rejected. The crossroads is, though, we either build information governance or we abandon all hope. And today you're making a real investment, and well, it's worth quoting Carrie Fisher of Star Wars. You know, she said that instant gratification takes too long. So with that in mind, and knowing your time is valuable, here are the goals that we're going to accomplish in the next few minutes. First, I want to share with you what I believe to be the key reason information governance in the 21st century, the first 16 years at least, has simply failed to make an effective case for the funding that's required to be effective. Number two, we're going to look at two critical opportunities of how to express that business case differently and effectively by embracing a new definition of what information governance really is all about. And finally, we'll talk about the surprising variable, the one thing that will distinguish the survivors and the winners over the next 20 years from all the rest. Now, security, information governance, regulation of IT, all of these seem to aim for the same objective, creating information assets that are effective, that are authentic, that are accurate, that we can rely upon as fact to make business decisions and to continue to do our job. But in truth, all of that ends up to saying, simply, can we trust our information? And while in the 20th century, almost anything coming out of these black boxes called computers was considered magical and original, today, none of us can presume to trust digital information as fact. Indeed, our human instincts are beginning to start at a different point where our willingness to trust digital information has become so tentative that it almost begins at zero. And to be honest, if we could move to negative numbers like the Federal Reserve and others are considering with interest rates, we might even move into negative numbers to express the confidence we have, particularly in making business decisions, to trust our information. So why have these business disciplines of security and information governance and regulation compliance failed to secure the required funding? The answer, I think, is simple. All of these services have been viewed to date as risk management services. They are not core business functions that create wealth. So let me give you an example. Let's zoom in on a recent board meeting when there was consideration of the IG funding proposal and the comparative benefits and costs. Not much like Butch Cassidy and Sundance, standing on the ledge where the sheriff is chasing them and shooting bullets, and their choice is to jump into the bottomless chasm of the river. But given that choice, so often, like with information security, information governance has been viewed as not producing or delivering anything. No goods, no services. It's just something we have to do because we have to do it. And so the response of the senior executive teams is to not fully fund your proposals and say it's worth taking the risk, kind of like choosing between the posse and the deep, deep river below you. And that's the point. See, information governance is viewed as a risk management expenditure. Risk management, if you look at a balance sheet, is funded from only one source: the net earnings that would be otherwise distributed to the shareholders. Every unit of currency that is spent on risk management is a reduction in profits. As a consequence, when we protest and we say there's a risk by not getting the right funding, we're going to incur fines and sanctions and legal fees. Well, frankly, the board kind of looks over their shoulder as they're walking out, and, well, you can see what they say. In my book, I call this the exercise of the Rhett Butler rule. Now, the boards are prepared to take the risks of noncompliance. They are prepared to have nominal information governance because we simply are unable to date as a profession to answer this essential question: how will information governance increase our wealth or preserve our wealth better than the status quo? That struggle has consistently been the explanation. Governed information is not seen by accounting professionals as an asset on a balance sheet. But something is changing. So in January of last year, JP Morgan Chase announced to their shareholders in a 90-plus page report, after spending more than $30 billion on fines and sanctions in the last few years, they were making an investment, nearly $3 billion itself, hiring 2,000 more compliance officers to assure that the corporation's business behavior and conduct could be governed more effectively. But to do so, what were they doing besides hiring people, but investing in technology that tracked information to enable business governance, even to the point that a keystroke logger on a mobile device of an employee might recognize the pattern of an improperly entered Social Security number in an email and block the email because it was not within the scope of authority of the cell phone user. That's cool. It's shifting. And Mark Benioff last year at the World Economic Forum said, digital revolution, it needs a trust revolution. And when he said that, it kind of turned my own flux capacitor into high gear. And I wrote my book, and to be honest, I came up with, in doing so, not only a model for trust and digital trust, I think it then provides a platform for how we can define information governance differently. So that's where I want to move us to at this moment. Here is a new model. Information governance is the rules-based management of digital information to assets to create or preserve wealth. What are the markers that we're seeing that this is the actual model that the largest industry leaders are beginning to embrace? Well, they're creating officers, executives called chief data officers, equivalent to a CFO or an operations executive. In other words, they're seeing the data as an asset that connects to wealth. Doug Laney at Gartner has talked about infonomics and continues to help shape the vision of data as property, something that companies own, possess, control, perhaps even something they manufacture, along with their other goods or services. If you look at this definition, though, I want to emphasize a couple words. First, it is rules-based. In other words, we have to know what the rules are, and that it's focusing on the digital information assets. You know, human history, corporate behavior, transactional records are soon being merged so that virtually all of the human body of knowledge will be stored digitally. Paper will be extraneous. And so if that's true, winners will be those that understand how to connect digital information to the wealth creation objectives. And so that brings us to stating the business case differently. We have historically emphasized fines, sanctions, and negative money expending as a risk that has to be satisfied. But how does information governance in the 21st century improve our ability to create wealth for our shareholders? For corporations, that is their purpose for being. And I would suggest to you that we do that by taking a slowing down moment and pausing and sharing this insight. Every transaction first requires an affirmative calculation to trust. Maybe you're at Home Depot buying a hammer. Maybe you're downloading a link to view this webcast. Maybe your corporate system is moving data objects through the cloud on fiber optics, literally moving at the speed of light. In each of these situations, though, before you push the buy button, before you push the send button, there is a calculation to trust. Now, I want to emphasize, trust is not an emotion. It is instead a decision, a calculation that, like a mathematical formula, requires rules and information. The information we govern becomes the fuel for making decisions that lead to transactions that create wealth. Information governance creates wealth because it delivers the information that's required for the transactions, whether it's between departments internally, whether it's externally with customers, whether it's within the broader ecosystem of suppliers and networks that we compete in, whether it's across machines, whether it's interacting with government. Data helps create wealth when it enables trust. How does that connect us back? Well, here's a thought experiment. Think of the standard commercial deal between a buyer and a seller. Buyer's about to pay consideration to the seller for something. It could be a hammer, it could be a data file, but there's value that's being seen. We know what happens on the seller side. From every revenue unit that comes in, there is a mandatory reduction to basically underwrite risk events, called a risk reserve. It's the money that's kept in the basement in case bad things happen. It could be a fire, it could be a car accident, it could be a class action lawsuit. But some portion of revenue has to be set aside to fund those contingencies. Now, we know that one of the areas where that will often go is towards the legal department and, in theory, to handle information management in the 20th century, finding the evidence that we need. But remember that all risk reserve funding is like everything else we've talked about. It's an expense that is taken away from and competes against net earnings. So when you spend on risk reserves, you're actually taking money away from the bottom line. That's a fairly standard concept in business. But what about the customer's perspective? See, within every spending unit that I have as a buyer to spend is an inherent, hidden, but still discretionary trust discount. That's right. Every time a buyer prepares to purchase a good or a service, whether it's a digital asset, whether it's a car or a trip around the world, the trust discount is an unstated amount, essentially the buyer's risk reserve, which says, you know, if things go wrong with this product or good or service, I want to maybe pay less money. There's a bad reputation. Look what happens when you deal with a 2-star vendor on eBay versus a 5-star vendor. You actually pay differently. And so what we understand is that the consumer buyer in exercising that trust discount is influenced by the information they have about the product itself. So when that information about the product, the retailer, the manufacturer, the supply chain is not available, it's harder for the buyer to calculate trust, and as a result, the trust discount is larger. They will pay less for the goods and services that are involved. And so that actually identifies an opportunity for us in information governance to be able to think differently about how we add to the bottom line if, for example, information governance reduces the trust discount and increases the revenue from every single transaction. If I do either, if I reduce the seller's risk reserve or I can earn the trust discount of the buyer, I create greater wealth from every transaction. Now we're beginning to get somewhere because we're realizing that governed information is accessible to the business decisions of our buyers is information that actually creates more money. But it requires something. It requires transparency. Think of buying some Raisin Bran. Last night you heard on the news a story that a major manufacturer was putting Raisin Bran out where not plump, juicy raisins, but unfortunately, due to poor sanitary conditions, rat turds were being found in the product. And this morning, you had to go to the store to buy some cereal for your children. Now, there's two products that are available. One is the sealed box with the pretty pictures and really cute-looking animals or sunshine, and it's nice, but you don't know what's inside. And the other one's a cellophane bag that allows you to look through and see that, in fact, the information is available to you that those are really plump, juicy raisins rather than rat turds. Which would you pay more for? Time and again, my students at the University of Oxford and at Johns Hopkins tell me that they would pay more when they have the information to have the confidence that the risk of rat turds is not present with the product they're being asked to buy for. Now, the same is true in every business transaction. In a merger and acquisition, the due diligence is involved in looking at the target seller's assets is all about validating the authenticity of the information. In buying data for big data analytics engines, the buyer is constantly looking at the quality and the integrity of the information, asking, where has that information been? How has it been governed? So to create a business case that connects information governance to wealth creation, the business model has to move away from risk management and towards emphasizing the rules. And so that becomes the strategy. Information governance must commit to a rules-based model for building trust. It's how we calculate trust. If we don't have an understanding of the rules by which information was created, maintained, edited, accessed, deleted, modified, we don't understand its provenance based on the rules and the ability to show those rules have been satisfied, information governance fails to make the business case. Now, let me give you an example from a completely different field. Think about building architects. They are responsible for pulling together the rules from electrical codes and plumbing codes and roofing codes and floodplain codes. There's no single magic book for all of the rules that an architect has to navigate, not only to build a safe structure, but to be certified by the government agencies as being permitted to build and allowing occupancy upon construction. In many ways, up to now, records and information management from the 20th century and as we evolve toward IG was patching our services onto innovations after the design was put in place. Much like being asked to install plumbing in a 14th century castle, it just doesn't work very well. You make compromises, and instead of installing it in the castle, you add a room on the side. We can't do that with IG. We have to connect the rules more closely. Why? Because, as we mentioned at the outset, the costs continue to climb and therefore make using information in business more and more expensive. And it's just not finding the stuff. That's been in the eDiscovery space. Now that we've gotten more efficient at finding poorly engineered data, we're discovering there's another problem, which is to validate it is authentic as fact. Now, this is nothing that's small. It happens in every single sign-on session. It happens every time you go to a payment service to be able to pay your bills. We're validating the identity, the system, the server, the browser, the information that's being submitted. We're constantly in the guts of computing looking for evidence of inauthenticity. And that costs money. So for buyers, for sellers, for corporate management, for regulators, everyone is incurring these same expenses. As information is offered, it not only has to have the expense of finding the stuff, but now in the 21st century, we also have to validate it is fact and not fiction. If you look across the supply chains of data that we are moving to conduct trade, those are substantial costs. That's what we're beginning to focus on. Not the fines and the sanctions, but the efficiency of business itself, in which transactions are fueled by information that must first be trusted to make the decisions. So what's the essential strategy? How do we migrate to rules-based design? Well, with apologies to those of you in the audience that may have a certain educational standing as a lawyer, the first thing we do is read Shakespeare. In Henry VI, Part 2, as Dick the Butcher was conspiring with his friend, slightly intoxicated, he said, the first thing we do is we'll kill all the lawyers. Now, obviously, the goal here is not to reduce the size of the profession, but really to change the way we write our rules. Nearly all of the laws, which are often the foundation of where we begin in information governance, many of the technology standards are authored with an intentional ambiguity that becomes an obstacle to calculating trust. You have a rule that has words in it that require interpretation. It's very hard to write the code that produces the ones and zeros that literally allow trust to be calculated and added up. When you ask the lawyer the meaning of the word, and the lawyer comes back and says, it depends, it's very hard to program the computer. And so to calculate trust isn't to kill all the lawyers, but to eliminate from the rules these words of ambiguity that make it so difficult to calculate trust with confidence. Now, I use the phrase SIAM words. Good question. What are SIAM words? I'm not referring to a former nation in Southeast Asia. Instead, I'm referring to those words that have semantically, intentionally, ambiguous meaning. Hopefully all of you are now smiling as you think about one of the rules or regulations that you're trying to satisfy just today and realizing that we don't really know what is required. Reasonable, enforceable, adequate, timely, appropriate. These words require compliance, but they don't give us a predictable way of assuring confidence that the factual information subject to the rules has all the appropriate protections and controls, what we otherwise call governance. So in my book, I tell the story of two companies, and the companies are taking different approaches to building control of their data, building trust in their information. And in one company where the developers were particularly frustrated with the law department, they came into the workroom the next day and the following was on their bulletin board. Yeah, that's another chasm, kind of like Butch Cassidy and Sundance. See, the chasm of SIAM is this functional gap between the rules that are stated with SIAM vocabulary and the precision required for executing governance. If you recall Indiana Jones, you know within the chasm are, you might say, the risks of choosing poorly. And developers struggle. IG professionals struggle. Imagine a rule that said, companies shall institute reasonable information security appropriate to the sensitivity of the personal information stored on their distributed systems. There's so many SIAM words that developers simply give up trying to get clear, articulate responses. We have to change the way we write the rules. See, everyone downstream from an information asset is seeking to use that data, but remember, they also need to calculate their trust in the information. They have to have confidence that it is fact. And that means they have rules, and they're looking for information that allows them to have confidence the data asset itself can be trusted. That brings us to an interesting control issue that we have to address in designing IG for the 21st century. To trust digital information, you must also first trust its source. It used to be easy in the 20th century to just have someone swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. You could look in their eyes to determine the demeanor of integrity which they had in sharing information. But in cyberspace today, we have a whole lot of more sources that we have to consider. This map, 4 years old now, shows 460 million reachable IPv4 addresses. Astonishing. Now it's even closer to 1 billion. And so as we look at the question of how do we trust information, we realize we have to ask the computer to participate. We have to ask the computer to help us validate information, which means the computer does need to calculate. That's what they do in computers. They add things up to see if you get the result you need. But the challenge today, when we query our computers to determine how to calculate trust in information, is not unlike talking to Hal the computer in 2001. His cold, unblinking red eye does not inform us how to calculate trust. And now we have presumed rather than calculate trust, but now the time has come to adopt a new model. So, what makes a good rule? Well, it's a good question. And the key here within the time we have before my flux capacitor takes me back to the future. It's to eliminate the cyan vocabulary and author rules that enable metrics. Literally, everything needs to add up mathematically to reach affirmative trust in the information. Now, that shouldn't be a hard concept. If you think about it for a moment, a speed limit is actually a metric of compliance, of governance. And we've built tools, including detectors that sit above our automobiles on toll roads, as well as speed cameras that the officers use to detect noncompliance. But think about this in the more human fashion. When Indiana Jones was standing at the ledge looking at his bottomless chasm, he had a source of information in his hands, his father's journal. Now, you may recall, his father has been shot. He's dodged through slicing blades, false floors, adventures around the world. He's now looking at a bottomless chasm, and he has to decide, does he trust the data to save his father's life? Does he trust the data to get to the Holy Grail? In his case, actually, if you look back at the moments in the movie, he was evaluating the source of the data. He knew his father. He knew the research his father had done to validate the information. He knew the sources of the sources of the sources. He had inspected the shield buried with the rats in the oily dungeons of Venice. But at the end of the day, it was a calculation that though it was against all possible assessment of risk, he was able to step into the chasm and walk across. Now, what are some other metrics? You think of Google speed. When you do a Google search, it tells you how fast they found everything you need. Measuring the time to initiate an action, the time to complete an action, the time between actions, the accuracy, the frequency, the number of times the supervisor has to intervene. All of these add up so that we know time is money. So when you're looking at those costs of validating information, what's really involved is the time we require to be able to make those calculations. And the more time that's consumed, the more times we can't complete the calculations because we don't have the information, the more expensive it becomes for the company. Lost opportunity costs, diversion of resources. All of this keeps us from making money. And that's the wrong outcome. See, for us to get to our holy grail of effective information governance services, we have to do something more. Besides just finding and validating information efficiently, the 21st century is indeed beginning to recognize that data can have economic value. Hey, look at the bad actors. Look at what they're doing to compromise our systems to defeat our governance controls in order to gain access to the information. They would not do that if the information didn't have both indirect as well as direct economic value. Companies that are pursuing big data analytics are doing the same thing. They're using the information as an asset to create wealth, but only the information that can be trusted, only the information that has demonstrable evidence it has been effectively governed. Look at how big data analytics engines work, and if the evidence of their governance is not available and transparent, then the result is the data is embargoed and excluded, and the purchase price of that data, the licensing fees, the discounts that are available, all alter. So we're right at the cusp. How do we follow the lead of companies like J.P. Morgan? They are achieving what they're accomplishing with their governance by creating trust in the information. They know that by combining big data and governance, they can see, anticipate, and shut down non-compliance behavior. But something more, with their analytics, they can create insights. They can create computational efficiency. They can see shifts in behaviors almost before the consumers even know it. No different than Facebook being able to tell us when we're about to be engaged, even though we don't know that the loved one has popped the question. It's all about getting ahead of the curve, and you can only do that with information that can be trusted. So there's one more feature. One is rules. The second is the last one that I want to share with you in the time. That's something that I call the velocity principle. Now, let me pause here for a moment. Back in 2011, there was an earthquake that hit Virginia. Fairly good size, 5.9 on the Richter scale. Residents in New York City read about the quake 30 seconds before they experienced the quake themselves on their Twitter feed. And then a couple years later, the SEC fined the New York Stock Exchange millions of dollars for violating a rule. I looked at that and I began to think about that in terms of what IG delivers to industry and to our corporate owners and shareholders. See, the SEC was upset because the rule required the stock exchange to distribute market data and trading data on terms that were, get ready for the cyan vocabulary, fair and reasonable and not unreasonably discriminatory. But when the SEC investigated several years after the rule was put in effect, they found that the stock exchange was not, in fact, distributing the data on non-discriminatory terms. They, in fact, saw discrimination. But my goodness, the size of the microscope was astonishing. The fines were based on transmissions by the stock exchange that ranged in disparities between recipients of single-digit milliseconds, maybe 100 or more milliseconds. 100 milliseconds is 1/10 of a second. Imagine blinking that, right? And yet that's enough time for the velocity of the data to affect the validity and integrity of the market. There were even a few instances where the distribution of the data was distinguished by lapses of full seconds. Now, if the market investments are no longer long-term reasoned decisions, but literally letting technology transform the timing with which we execute, creating wealth, we understand that every information asset that moves across our systems and that we access to rely upon to make business decisions must itself be effectively governed. I emphasize this moment where we're validating the information. Think of a data packet, a file, a memorandum, a unstructured data, structured data object in a single cell. Every time that moves, it's no different than a visitor coming to the border of a foreign land. We have to validate its integrity. We want to know where it came from. And in turn, whether all the rules were properly fulfilled to keep the data safe as it crosses our border and into the control of our systems. I love this picture because the immigration officer is looking at the visitor and not only relying on his eyes, but he's making a comparison to an official form of identification, making an evaluation of the passport. There's a screen to his right that allows him to check other databases, even as a phone. Multiple validations, but what happens to the visitor? She's standing there, doing nothing. If our information simply stands there and does nothing, our businesses will fail to win the competitive battles of the next 2 decades and more. So the velocity principle has, as I suggested, an unexpected perspective. It provides that the velocity of information is proportional to the transparency of its governance. Now, every lawyer is representing a corporation takes the instinct we have to protect our data. We don't want to share it. We don't want to show the information to other people. Transparency is inimicable to strong security. And yet, information waits at the border of an application, a device, a system, doing nothing unless we can provide the data about how it has been governed. So as we pursue rule-based design, it's not merely doing that to store the data better, but to give it velocity itself. Information that is well governed and that can be demonstrated to be well governed is information that is valued. That value is translated into accelerating the pace at which transactions and business decisions are made. But when we fail to engineer our systems to measure performance against known rules and known metrics, we create shadows. We create doubt. We don't move the needle on the trust meter. Instead, we create risk because we did not govern our information. Look, the world is changing. We came from an end of the 20th century where we still knew what that floppy disk thing in the upper left corner of our browsers actually, and word processing actually is. We sort of still know what the file folder is. We don't know what that cell phone thing looks like of a rotary dial, but we know that we've been deconstructing our information. We've been making our data assets smaller and smaller. And the reason is when they are smaller, they move faster. A truth of the net, a truth of cyberspace is the smaller the data object, the greater its velocity. But that is only true when that data asset can be traced and paired with transparent rules and affirmative calculations of trust. This is going to be where the competitive advantage of information governance can achieve full fruition, by demonstrating that well-governed information, in addition to helping the business run better, can create new wealth. Rules-based design with metrics. Now, my flux capacitor clock is ticking down. I think I only have 2 minutes before Robin seizes control back of the webinar. But let me go through a brief summary. We talked about the Rhett-Butler rule as a way in which risk management decisions are often made. The trust discount, rules-based design, the chasm of Siam, the velocity principle. And I think I've had 8 movie metaphors. The world is still going to be changing. Today, Internet of Things, big data, digital currencies, blockchaining for distributed ledgers, all of these are working only because information is being governed at the smallest possible object. Hopefully, these comments will help spur you to be able to have new conversations with your teams, with your clients, with your corporate executives about the contributions information governance can make to the bottom line. Now, one more thing. I just want to share with you that with my book, I've made a commitment that every time a copy is purchased, I will donate a copy to help a professional association increase the velocity of their professionals that are rising from the next generation to lead us. They need to learn how to make trusted decisions. They need to learn faster how to make decisions that will be trusted by themselves as well as by others. And so if you're part of a professional organization that has a mentorship program or a protege program or a program to bring young professionals into your field, I'd love to hear from you and include that association in the community that will be benefiting from this book. So with that, let me turn it over to Robin. And Robin, I'll let you take back the control of the slides and the presentation, and I look forward to everyone's comments and questions.
I am so glad to be back in the present, and what a great presentation that was. I wanted to kick this discussion off with you with some questions that we had during the presentation. At least from my perspective, I agree with this input. Why is it so difficult to get a unified definition of information governance? For example, when I sat for the IGP, the basic definition was that governance is a discipline associated with maximizing the value of an organization's information while minimizing its risk. Do you feel that that's a good basic definition?
It's not a bad definition. The problem I always have with the word value is it's as ambiguous as Siam. We don't know what you mean by that. What I think it means is that people will trade other assets to me for my data. Right? So I own a bicycle and you want to buy the bicycle, you need to give me $100. That's value. If Sally down the street wants to pay me $150, that's maximizing the value of my bicycle. But oftentimes that expression isn't capturing the internal benefits of being able to have data that is trusted. think of pulling up a sales report going into a board meeting with regard to the Southeast region and the questions that we ask. Did Bob really write this report? Wasn't he out last week? Has anyone vetted these numbers against the databases for returns? Those kind of questions are actually retarding the pace of business. But we're not doing a good job of tracking the contributions of IG unless the rules are authored to measure those in objective and time-based expressions of value. So I think we're on the same track, but we're struggling because we haven't been able to understand that it's all about writing the rules. Once we write the rules properly, then we can transform the value. And I think that this concept of discipline associated with maximizing value has such an ambiguity that it's not as fulfilling as saying information governance over the next 7 years will return $55 million in net shareholder value to the corporation. When you express your value that way, nobody cares how you created it. They just want the proof that you will do so to give them the funding. You can only provide that proof by providing objective metrics.
Exactly, exactly. I noticed this year in reading the blogs and periodicals that I follow that over 50 topics at Legal Tech mentioned governance. Is that significant? Are we catching up with your foresight that we talked about in your introduction? What do you think that means?
I'm delighted to hear it. I didn't have a chance to go to Legal Tech this year. There's a caution there. The people that have been involved in eDiscovery have realized that they've tapped out the faucet for actually getting paid to find the stuff. And they're kind of scrambling right now to define their purpose going forward. Law firms, consulting firms, eDiscovery professionals, and even perhaps even some of the vendors. And the challenge is to demonstrate that the tasks of finding the data can also be, and the tools can be used to create trust and move the processes we've learned for validating data to the front of the development life cycle. So that instead of being the plumbing that's trying to be installed on a 14th century castle, we're actually building the design of the governance into the front end of the system. And so that the IT project, the innovation, the DevOps project doesn't move ahead until IG has signed off, and that we have the answer to the question, what will we do with all the data this new application provides? Where will we govern the information if we're deferring it to a software as a service cloud service vendor with 14 locations in 5 continents? Until those questions are being asked at the front end, then we're not achieving the end result we need to accomplish. Now, we've learned a lot over the last 15 to 20 years of digital information as evidence. But what we're now seeing in the competitive landscape of litigation is a tension between corporations that have tried to push to minimize the disclosure of data and those corporations that take a different approach and say, hey, here's our data. It's trustworthy. It can be affirmed as fact. Here's the provenance. And we believe this data does not support your claims against us. Have at it. We're out of here. But it eliminates the governance of the information as the basis for the dispute rather than the facts that the information discloses. Now, the challenge is going to be that for many in the field, this is not a one-off project that can be referred out to a consulting firm, but an institutional part of how the corporation will be governed. And I think that's what we're beginning to see in things like legal tech is kind of a fire drill to find out who's going to be doing the work. The answer to me is it's going to be corporate IT assets working with corporate professionals, bringing in the technology tools, the software products, the cloud-based services that can allow that provenance to be demonstrated and consistently available. Some of the standards that are developing in some of the advanced technology working groups like W3C and the ISO, the Cloud Security Alliance, are actually building protocols for the provenance of a record to be associated with that record wherever it is. Kind of it doesn't matter where it is. It's ambient. Wherever the data is, I can prove its history. That's exciting, and that's where I think we're going to have to move. But it's nothing that's going to be fought over in a courtroom. It has to be in the design of the system.
That would seem to make sense. Some of the research, and I think I discussed this with you, some of the research that I've done into hiring practices within corporations over the last decade or so have revealed 6 communities of practice who were involved in regulatory and discovery requests, and the ones that you mentioned, security, privacy, risk, compliance, legal records, are all becoming involved in that, and it appears to bear up who will be doing the work going forward. It makes a great deal of sense. I've got one last one to have you opine on. Sedona has said for a while that eDiscovery will become a larger discipline of governance. And again, I've seen some corporations change their eDiscovery staff to report under governance. What is your experience with that?
I think there's going to be a real battle in the turf landscapes of corporations between 2 forces. Legal, who believes they are in the business of risk management, and this emerging discipline of essentially chief data officers, executives that are tasked with the responsibility of assuring that the information assets of the company perform the work that they are provided to do and provide the interactions to help create wealth. There's a real question, to be honest, as to whether the risk management orientation of lawyers that embrace cyan vocabulary are well positioned to embrace those business values. So what then the question becomes is, will the eDiscovery function shift over to the chief data officers? Or at Salesforce, they have a chief trust officer. The officer at Cisco has global responsibilities as the Senior VP of Security and Trust. So I think that eDiscovery staffing is going to fluctuate where it sits for a while. And I have some skepticism as to whether it belongs under legal as such. But with all of that in mind, then the question is, where does governance sit? Ultimately, governance begins at the CEO level, and it's going to be her responsibility in any business to make that allocation. But if governance is a way of creating wealth, then it may be more possible that it will sit other than under the legal department as such. But, you know, in my ideal world that I'm going to travel back to in a few minutes, there is no more eDiscovery because the information is factual, its provenance is well known, it can be found because it was well governed, and therefore we don't need to be looking to find the truth or only find part of the truth. The truth is there, and that shapes the way the business will be operated. That's why I think the J.P. Morgan Chase development and others are so important, because what we're seeing from at least a legal compliance perspective, but there it's a business compliance perspective, is we're shifting from absorbing the risks of non-compliance to improving our profitability by following a path toward compliance. And that's a big shift.
Excellent. Well, on behalf of the team at BIA, I want to thank everyone who tuned in to our February edition. Our coming webinar will be third Thursday of the month, as always, 1 o'clock Eastern, 10 a.m. Pacific. Next month we have Brett Tarr, Counsel, Litigation, and eDiscovery at Caesars Entertainment with us, who's going to talk to us about using analytics in a corporate law department. Lastly, we are deeply honored that we were joined today by Jeffrey Ritter, and thank you for your valuable time in helping us to understand how we can build ROI for information governance in our own corporations.
Well, thank you, Robin. It's a pleasure, and I'll look forward to seeing everyone in the future.